Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and my guest today is Alan Annand. Hello, Alan.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me.
It's lovely. And you know what? When I first contacted you, I had no idea that we were going to be talking about Mercury retrograde during a retrograde Mercury period.
Wow, you're a risk taker.
Risk taker. Yeah, I think that's probably me. So, so the reason that I thought it would be good to talk about this is because I saw an article that you wrote for the Astrology Lodge of London, quarterly, about the Vedic view of retrograde Mercury. And it resonated with my own view, although I'm not a Vedic astrologer. And I thought, oh, this is nice. It's refreshing. Let's talk about it. So while everybody is running around worrying about retrograde Mercury, and indeed, I mean, in my own experience in the last 2 weeks, there have been misplaced keys, forgotten keys, flat tires, the usual run of the mill events that we associate with retrograde Mercury. But there's more to this, isn't there?
Yeah, I think there is. And the first question I always ask about this is, why do we pick on Mercury? I mean, Venus goes retrograde, Mars, Jupiter, all the planets go retrograde. Why this big mania about Mercury? I mean, I've been observing this for several years, and I've taken it to task a number of times, poking fun at the whole phenomenon. An article in the Mountain Astrologer many years ago was a humorous take on why was everybody picking on poor little Mercury when there were other retrograde planets to pick on. And, I think this has been perpetuated to a great degree by astrologers. I mean, I'm going to say, to their discredit, I think the American Federation of Astrologers publishes a little, sort of wallet-sized card showing the retrograde periods for any given year, as if this must be kept uppermost in mind, and you've got to constantly remind your clients about it. It's an easy out. If somebody says, "Well, what do you think? Should I, marry this guy?" Well, forget about it. It's Mercury retrograde. Cancel the engagement, or any other more mundane examples that we could apply to that. And I think it's really quite unfair. And I don't think there's any substance to it as well either. A number of years ago, again with this, topic in mind, I looked at 60 major disasters that had occurred over the past century. I mean, the thesis is, if you're a Mercury retrogradist, the thesis is, everything goes to hell in a handcart when Mercury is retrograde, right? So all kinds of bad stuff happens. So I wanted to test that thesis, and as I say, I looked at 60 major disasters, with significant loss of life. There were natural disasters, earthquakes and tsunamis and cyclones. There were maritime disasters, the sinking of the Titanic, but any number of other, large ferries and so on. There was rail disasters, and then there was airline disasters, all of which, have accounted for significant loss of life, especially natural disasters. So I looked at these 60 events, that all had a known date, times for some of them, but that's not important when you're looking at Mercury retrograde. And I examined to see how frequent was the prevalence of Mercury retrograde. And actually, it was just barely above chance. There are other things that are more significant in terms of disastrous effects, and those are hard aspects between Sun and Moon, hard aspects between Moon and Jupiter, and hard aspects between Sun and Saturn. So, it's much more worrisome to be under a sort of a conjoined influence when, let's say, Sun and Saturn are square and it's a full moon, and Jupiter is, in that configuration, hard angles as well, too. That's much more worrisome than Mercury retrograde. So this was an article that I'd published in the American Federation of Astrologers. Even as I'm putting them down for their little Mercury retrograde card, I credit them for in past years having put out several research journals with, sort of quasi-scientific articles. I include mine among those, being quasi-scientific because I'm not a statistician. But that article was published several years ago, and there's really not much evidence of Mercury retrograde, being the thorn in the side for so many people as is often talked about. I have a recent example, for instance, in my own life. For the past couple of weeks, I've had, an engine warning light turning up in the dashboard of my vehicle. And, I read in the manual, it says, okay, you don't ignore this, you take it to your dealer and get it dealt with right away. Or start and stop the car several times, and it might clear the indication. Well, I did that so many times, I gave up, and then I booked, an inspection at my dealership. Then the day that Mercury retrograde occurred, the warning light cleared. All right, that's counterintuitive. Thank you very much. That warning light should have come on during Mercury retrograde, not go off. And so, I've been driving it for another week since that happened, and no more warning lights. So I'm about to call the dealership and say cancel my diagnostic visit because Mercury retrograde has fixed it for me. Thank you very much.
I think there is a marked difference between the catastrophic imaginings and warnings that are given and the disruptions to daily life that do seem to accompany, in my experience, retrograde Mercury periods, as in the keys being misplaced, etc., etc. Flat tires, people turning up to replace flat tires and not turning up when they're supposed to. It's the daily disruption of things, but that's not catastrophic. And I have bought cars on retrograde Mercuries. I have done lots of things on retrograde Mercuries that have had very happy endings. So I'm with you on that. What do you feel is the most constructive approach to a retrograde Mercury?
Well, let me just give you the perspective in Vedic astrology first regarding retrograde Mercury. If you imagine our solar system, obviously with the sun at the center, Mercury revolves immediately around the sun, then Venus, and then Earth, and then the other planets. So Mercury and Venus are what we call inferior planets, not because they're smaller or less dignified than us, but they lie interior to Earth's orbit. So those two planets, when they are in their retrograde periods, they are actually between Earth and the sun, as opposed to being on the far side of the sun. So that actually means that all else being equal, a planet, Mercury or Venus, being closer to us than normal, that is between us and the sun, they will appear brighter than normal. Now, obviously, if Mercury or Venus is passing directly in front of the sun, that's what we call combustion. And combustion is, considered deleterious because it diminishes or completely negates the visibility of the planet. Retrogression, however, if the planet is Mercury or Venus is not immediately in front of the sun, it will actually be brighter, sort of off in the periphery of the sun, than it would be if it were on the far side of the sun, because on the far side of the sun, it's much further away and its light is dimmer. So, long story short, in Vedic astrology, a retrograde planet is brighter than normal in its cycle, and therefore more visible in the sky, with the exception of temporary combustion. More visible in the sky makes it more noticeable, let's say as a morning star. Either Mercury or Venus can function as a morning star or an evening star. And then they can be very visible in their retrograde periods because they're closer to us than normal. In Vedic astrology, a planet that is brighter than normal looms larger in our visibility and, you know, as a consequence, should be accorded more interest or notice. And that applies to the outer planets as well, too. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn have their own retrograde periods. And if you map those in a horoscope, you'll find that they're always generally on the other side of the horoscope from the sun. So it's sort of the planetary equivalent of a full moon. If you look at a full moon configuration in a horoscope, sun on one side, moon somewhere on the opposite side of the horoscope. With the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, it's not quite that obvious, you know, diametrically opposite, but generally on the other side of the horoscope from the sun, and therefore brighter. So in Vedic astrology, these retrograde planets, brighter than normal, loom larger in the sky, more visible, and we pay more attention to them because of that. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question now in how do I deal with Mercury retrograde? Take me back. What was your question?
No, I think that that's a very important point because it's something that kind of has been lost unless you're a traditional astrologer. The
Right.
idea of the brightness of the planet being important, and in here you're pointing out that during retrograde periods, Mercury is actually brighter, and that is significant, and it's significant in a positive way. So, how would a Vedic astrologer then look at a retrograde Mercury period?
The period, the transiting period. Well, merely that if for a natal chart constructed at that time, and if that Mercury is retrograde, that Mercury is brighter than normal, and that is one of the measures of strength for the planets. All the planets, you know, not counting Sun and Moon, which are luminaries, but the true planets, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. If they are retrograde, they're brighter than normal, and they are therefore accorded a degree of strength, which we then, you know, apply in the interpretation of the horoscope, relevant to whatever Mercury occupies or owns in the horoscope. It occupies one house, it owns two other houses. So
And
it's given a strength. So if you're measuring, you know, whether it's you know, it's the 10th house lord or occupant, you know, you will say something about career. The person's got literate or numerate skills, negotiation skills, and so on and so forth, with a certain degree of strength because that Mercury is strong.
and that is a significant difference in weighing up the strengths and weaknesses of planets in traditional astrology from the Western side, where retrogradation is considered to be a weakness because it's not considering the brightness, it's considering the fact that the direction is going in reverse. So, what do you feel is the most positive way to approach this period of retrograde Mercury?
I really don't think about it, to tell you the truth. I pay little or no attention to transiting retrogression versus direct. You know, and perhaps that's a consequence of my 2 decades or more now in Vedic astrology. Let's paint a broader picture. Western astrology tends to place a great emphasis upon transits. You know, the recent ingress of Pluto into Aquarius. I mean, much to do about that, right? Much hypothesizing about something that we haven't seen in 240 years, and how you can take 240-year-old events, bring them up into the current, you know, time space and extrapolate. You know, it's really an exercise in invention. But let's see, I've lost my track on this. I don't pay much attention to transits. As a Vedic astrologer, we're much more interested in periods. It's the equivalent, you know, in Hellenistic astrology, there are planetary periods. In Vedic astrology, there are planetary periods as well that sort of map out whole swaths of a life, anywhere from 6 to 20 years in major periods. And each of those can be, you know, sliced and diced into 9 minor periods. Vedic astrologers become conditioned to view life much more through this lens of major and minor planetary periods, what Vedic astrologers call dashas and bhuktis, and much less concern about transits. Yes, transits can be triggers, but I don't know about you, but I've had lots of experience of getting excited about this, that, or the other transit coming through my chart. I mean, let's take a thing like as simple a thing as, oh, Jupiter is going to be transiting my 10th house next year, and getting like really excited about that, and then nothing happens, right? So what is about transits? Over the years, I've become, cynical regarding the effect of transits, and as a consequence, don't pay much attention to that anymore. How to deal with it? Go about life as normal, and it really, the transits don't affect me. I think we're all operating on our own sort of automatic pilot, which is generated by our natal horoscope, and that drives so much of our behaviors. The strength and weakness of planets in the horoscope create a kind of a psychological imprint. In Vedic astrology, we call these the vasanas, which are sort of natal impulses that drive us to do certain things, to go towards certain things, to avoid other things. And that is a kind of an imprint that conditions us for the rest of our lives. Transits come and go, major periods come and go, but we're still operating as per our desire to achieve certain things, embrace certain things, and avoid other things. And then, the disposition of the planets also sort of, measures out our karma as well, too. We might desire very much to be a millionaire. I mean, frankly, who doesn't? And lots of people attend these millionaire mind seminars, and yet does everyone become a millionaire? Certainly not. Just because you can dance on your two hind feet doesn't mean that God will toss you a cookie for being a good dog.
What I actually enjoyed in reading your article was the approach to the interpretation that you gave to retrograde Mercury. And you talked about it being an opportunity. And so I'd like you to tell us about that particular view.
Well, I don't recollect quite what I said in terms of an opportunity. I mean, I know Western astrologers will use this sort of, generic off-the-shelf piece of advice, which is now is a good time to review, reflect, look inward, all this sort of thing that is associated with, backward motion or retrogression. I think that during Mercury retrograde periods, our intellectual faculties might be heightened to a greater degree, and we become more naturally introspective, analytic, and I think it's a good time out. Mercury retrograde periods happen like basically 19% of the time, right? So, X number of days out of the year, we've got opportunities to reflect. And I think that's appropriate for any of us in a busy world to take that opportunity to do that. I'd like to address something actually about Mercury retrograde, and I think why it's become such a bugaboo for Western astrologers, and I think I raised this in the article. In the context of a horary chart, Mercury retrograde can be a real problem. For instance, if your client presents you with a question, Anna, I'm quite serious about this guy. Should I marry him? And, as it happens, one of the dual signs is rising. So, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces. And let's make the assumption we're traditional astrologers. And so now it's a seventh house matter. Client is the first house. Her proposed topic is marriage, seventh house. So it's an issue of what is the relationship between Mercury and Jupiter in that horary chart. Now, if Mercury, let's say first that they are in a trine situation, right? And Mercury's got lesser degrees than Jupiter. So in the normal course of things, as time would pass, Mercury would get closer to making that perfect trine to Jupiter. First Lord and seventh Lord would make a trine, and it's a applying aspect, let's say. And your answer would be, yes, looks good, go ahead. But what if Mercury is retrograde? So Mercury is not going to go forward to complete the perfection of that trine with Jupiter. It is actually backing out of it. And so depending on whether it is the ascendant Lord or the seventh Lord, your answer to that client may be, you have doubts, you may back out of this. Or if it's Mercury is the seventh Lord, you might say, your boyfriend is going to back out of it. He has doubts. Now, that is an instance where Mercury retrograde is a problem because a retrograde planet is typically failing to proceed in its normal direction and complete the perfection of a Ptolemaic aspect that we would have regarded as resolving or completing the contract, of the question. And for that reason, retrograde planets are a thorn in the side. But that's in a horary context only, not in the normal course of natal horoscopy. There's nothing wrong with having a retrograde planet in a natal chart. That does not mean a mental debility or stupidity or failure to analyze things or be introspective. It means something quite different. But it is a problem in horary. And I think that whole problem has been sort of transported wholesale into the analysis of natal horoscopy and has, taken a valid notion, but transferred it into natal horoscopy and actually kind of polluted the thought process, the analytic process, because it's a different context now. And I don't think people, take appropriate notice of that.
Absolutely. And I think that is why I was kind of teasing things apart, because I wanted to come to that point, because there is a difference between the traditional view of retrograde Mercury, which is, as you say, context specific to the horary question, and the difference then being used in a natal chart. The two are very different contexts, and it's something that I'm always at pains to explain to my students, who all get very excited about retrograde planets, actually, but Mercury in particular, as you have pointed out, which I think is the reason why we're having this conversation, to bring a little bit of perspective and context to the issue.
Now, there was a book published, wow, a long while ago, I'm going to say in the 80s. You might have it in your library because a lot of astrologers picked it up. Of course, it was directed for astrologers. Recent Advances in Natal Astrology by two British authors, Jeffrey Dean and Bill Mathers, I think. I'm not sure. But anyway, it was a relatively scientific statistical examination of all of the basic premises of astrology. It's quite a thick volume, and maybe it's like 300 pages. And I didn't review what they found this morning. I didn't review this morning what they found those 40 years ago. But what I do recall that there is no statistical evidence whatsoever for the horror that astrologers feel over Mercury retrograde. Now they poked holes in a lot of the basic premises of astrology, some of which we would naturally take exception to because, we see these play out in the lives of clients. But statistically, they found little evidence for much of this. But I do recall Mercury retrograde being one of those things that really got kicked aside as having little consequence for, statistical astrology. But, I don't think statistics serves astrology very well, and my teacher has always, poo-pooed any efforts to sort of statistically analyze anything using astrology, because there's so many factors. It really is a multivariate analysis, too complex perhaps to tease out everything. It's not just as simple a matter as having your sun in a fire sign that makes you an extrovert or something like that, or whatever thesis that you might want. Speaking of teachers, my teacher's guru, from whom he learned Vedic astrology, and he was here in Toronto for many years, where I had the opportunity to, spend a lot of time with him. And I'd asked him one day about how should I govern myself under the operation of retrograde planets. And he kind of waggled his finger at me and he says, "You are an astrologer. You control the planets. They don't control you. Let your clients worry about Mercury retrograde, not you." His basic advice was, go forth and do what you've got to do under the impulse of your own nature. Don't fret about the transits and whether they're direct or retrograde. And I've sort of held that advice close to my heart over the years when I'm on the verge of doing something. And look, do I occasionally, whip up an electional chart, to choose a time for, whatever, buying a house or, publishing a book? Yes, I do, but I'm not slavish about it. I mean, often the impulse is there and I'm doing it for a corroboration or out of a kind of a curiosity as well. But I'm not going to, live or die on the basis of an electional chart. I like his advice that, as an astrologer, you must, manage the planets and not let them manage you.
I think that is very important, because for those who are not, the matter particularly of prediction is extremely delicate, because would not wish to harm anyone. And so this is a very delicate matter. And looking at transits, but equally also looking at the birth chart, we have to look at things in a very sensitive way so as not to be amplifying existing fears or putting in fears where none existed before. So this is a very important thing to do, is to be very sensitive. And that was the reason why I felt it would be good to have a fresh look at the retrograde Mercury side of things, because there is a fair amount that is, I feel, perhaps put out of context and enlarged in people's minds, and it's time to address that. So I thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And if people want to find you and find out about your work, Alan, how do they do that?
Oh gosh, you can Google Alan Annand, so long as you get the name spelled correctly, Annand. I have a website. It's a little bit of a trick, and I should have thought to maybe put something up on screen, but it's navamsha.com. And the way it's spelled is Navamsa. It means ninth harmonic or ninth division, Navamsa. It's pronounced Navamsha, but Navamsa.
Perfect. I'll put it in the description box. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. And next time we're looking at astrology and the Second World War. Until then, goodbye.